Ultimately, the researchers fade into the backdrop, constrained by their dependence on R&D funding and by the legislative environment. Their influence as actors waned. So, we're still at this very early stages. We're 6 months in. And at this moment, you still have like the good vibes of academia, and you still have idealists who are founders, but governments are more powerful than than researchers. And if AI really hits in the way that some people think it will, these decisions ultimately are going to be out of the hands of the original inventors. So savor this moment when we still have the AI researchers being the ones who are sort of driving and shaping the discussion, because the window may not be open for much longer. AI, it's more than OpenAI. To discuss the wide and wonderful world of sort of startups and established firms and whatever is going to come next from a sort of market perspective, which will then, inevitably flow into government and policymaking, I have on to discuss Matthew Lindley, the author of the fantastic new Supervised newsletter, which you can find at supervised.news, where he covers everything there is to be covered about AI and startups. Also co-hosting today is Danny Crichton, returning to ChinaTalk as the head of editorial at Lux Capital. Let's jump in with HuggingFace. Matt, what is this company and why is it important?
First off, it's existed since well before ChatGPT. But today it's, they started off trying to be what is kind of colloquially referred to as the GitHub of AI. GitHub is where programmers basically manage their code. So if GitHub is where you're managing your code, HuggingFace is where you would manage machine learning models. That's not just large language models, although obviously there are a ton of them there. It is a very, very deep rabbit hole that you could spend hours and hours and hours going through what's on there. But they also have a variety of tools on top of it. So you can, their biggest tool is an API or a package called Transformers that you use to deploy and work with those same machine learning models. It's really straightforward for programmers. I can use it, which is probably saying something, because in terms of like my level of technical ability. And it's so it's a $2 billion company. Lux is an investor, obviously, but so is Sequoia Capital. A lot of big names that you see in it, and it's kind of become synonymous with the open source community and machine learning. So they, in the same way that some of these bigger open source communities are managed by the companies that manage the software for it. So there's one called DBT Labs, for example, that manages an open source tool called DBT. HuggingFace has kind of like fallen into being the steward for the community around open source machine learning models. That, of course, is all byproduct of the fact that, like, in the last 6 months, we all just got hit in the face with a wiffle bat about how like you could actually use these machine learning models, these large language models, to do all these crazy things. But it's become probably one of the most important startups in artificial intelligence, because that's just where a lot of these models are being stored, being updated, being deployed. And that's where you can go and get them and use them yourself.
I think the metaphor of GitHub works well. The difference between a lot of computer code and GitHub was, GitHub was a storage place where you put your code. You can copy the code, you can use it if it's open source. People can borrow it, etc. When it comes to AI, it's not just code. You actually have to run these models. You have to train them. You have to get them up to speed. You have to operate them. And that's a whole different level of service. And so I think one of the things that HuggingFace really did is not just be a repository for code. It's also the community to understand that code. It's also the platform to run it. And running AI models is something that's actually been extremely hard, particularly for the most complicated models. And so having kind of pre-built recipes, having the best practices already built in, I think really helped HuggingFace to succeed over the last couple of years. And it's important that people note that they've been around, I think, about 5 years now. And so, they predate this huge, kind of revolution. They were there when the academics were there. And now as it has expanded, they've also helped to popularize the field as well.
So are they, GitHub famously is the one website that the Chinese government cannot block because it is so central to developers in China that, this is now the place where you host, dissident I remember the famous one was all the reporting about COVID that got censored in China was uploaded to GitHub. I'm curious, is Hugging Face, does it have does it like OpenAI's APIs famously are locked out of Chinese users? Has Hugging Face do they have a policy on this at this point? What's the sort of global and China specific reach of the platform?
I was going to say, I literally don't know. I will say, similar to GitHub, as you've identified, it has become the repository, right? And so if you're in the AI community, you are on Hugging Face. There's just no way to avoid it. And because it's sort of a network effect, and as you have more and more researchers and more of the engineers on board, everyone else has to join as well. So I don't know it's China policy or even whether it's accessible, but I imagine it falls into the same trap of GitHub for the Chinese regulators, where I think they would love to control everything on the web, but there are just some things that they cannot if they want to have access to the cutting edge and state-of-the-art technologies that are available.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned researchers, but one of the big things is obviously every machine learning hobbyist on the planet is using Hugging Face. That's using Hugging Face in some way or another, and these people with tons of time to kill and a lot of curiosity are honestly the ones that generally figure out the killer use cases for the internet. And that locking something like that out has a lot of downstream detrimental effects, in the same way that locking something like GitHub out has a lot of downstream detrimental effects, because it's become so essential in the machine learning community. If you want to be moving the industry forward in any way whatsoever, either from a commercial or open source or just for funsies, you have to be using Hugging Face.
So Matt, one of the sort of incredible things about Hugging Face and incredible things about AI development in general is the fact that there are open source models out there that are almost as good as as what Google and OpenAI have been able to develop. First, how is that even possible? And then maybe talk also about whether this is something that's sustainable or inevitable, or what the degrees of uncertainty are on to what extent open source will be able to continue to compete with the big boys.
Yeah. So as good is probably one of the most frustratingly subjective subjects in AI right now, because everyone has a different definition of what as good means. You can go MMLU score, or this is outperforms ChatGPT by 105% or whatever. It's benchmarks are screwed up to begin with, right? But I think that where a lot of innovation is happening in open source is just making these things available for anyone to make really specific adjustments for their use cases. So for example, if I'm I don't know, a legal firm or something like that, I'm ooh, AI, but I mean, obviously I can't use something or it may be a situation where I can't use it before. Is there a way that I could use a model that generally is good at reading documents and train it on my specific legal domain, and specifically the customers that I work with, the problems that they've faced, in order to create something that is specifically tuned for me? Another example that I heard recently was someone was using a model for onboarding where they would take all this data that they had stored in Confluence, take all this data that they had stored from their HR departments, build a pocket LLM with that through a technique called fine tuning, and then when someone joins, they get a kind of personalized assistant to tell them how the company works and show them around, and who to talk to for what. Build out this kind of mental map. And so these models that obviously they have, tons of issues with accuracy and stuff like that. I mean, even OpenAI's model has issues with accuracy in a lot of these ways. But the benefit of open source is that it's so flexible and so easy to customize. The benchmarks things is a completely different topic, that another rabbit hole that is worth going down at some point. But the value is that because these models aren't 1.6 trillion parameters or whatever the ensemble OpenAI has for GPT-4, they're small enough that you can train them very quickly and train them very effectively and cheaply to build these customized use cases, like a personal onboarding assistant, or document reader for my specific kinds of documents. A lot of that is thanks to Facebook's work on Llama, but there's a whole offshoot of these other open source models that satisfy different conditions like that.
I think like the consensus, like most impressive open source model has been what Facebook's done by like, I guess, sort of leaking
Open
Llama.
source.
What you know, what are they thinking with that? And sort of is it going to end up taking, you know, giant companies deciding to support open source to make sure that open source is able to still stay on board?
Yeah. So the Llama family of models that they've released are not commercially available. They're for, you know, that's why I say open source. They're for research purposes. Everyone's played with it at this point, you know, whether in some form or another. And a lot of the other open source models just take the learnings from Llama and apply them to new methodologies and new data sets and things like that. You know, they've had a commercial version on the roadmap for God knows how long at this point. Like the, you know, people I talked to expected it to come out in May, and then they expected it to come out in June. But there's a lot of, you know, challenges that go into putting out a model that can be used for commercial purposes, especially from a company like Meta, where they're under an enormous amount of scrutiny for everything except for Threads, apparently. But for everything else. But they pioneered a lot of interesting techniques in terms of cramming a lot of power into models that require less intensive compute resources. So they can be made faster. They can be made for in a cheaper way. They can be iterated on and adjusted very quickly. What Facebook inevitably does, Meta inevitably does, is still kind of an open question, I think, but they have a long history of being really successful in open source, particularly with a software they released called PyTorch, which is what pretty much powers all AI tools at this point. You know, I don't want to say in existence because, you know, Google's version, TensorFlow, obviously is still in place in a lot of different companies and products. But PyTorch has never been really monetized, right? It's sort of just like out there that and anyone can kind of use it. And so they could go in a lot of different directions. The benefit of you know, being the source of truth for these, you know, pocket LLMs with something like Llama is you get to kind of have a lot of influence in the direction of the way that community develops. You don't have control over it per se, because they could just like offshoot it, fork it, and do whatever they want with it, but you can influence it pretty directly. So it's still up for grabs, I think, for Meta, and we'll have to see what happens when they release their first commercially available model, because there is a commercially available model competitive with Llama now called Falcon, that came out what was that, 5 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, something like that. You can check my work and yell at me later, Danny. But that is commercially available, and so now it's like Llama faces competition, but like, is that really Meta's point? ... Right. So yeah. So anyone can build these using the same methodologies and techniques that Meta deployed for Llama. It's just a question of like what data do they have access to.
Yeah. So let's sort of like broaden out the question about open source. You know, there's been some a little bit of discussion over the past few months about this idea of like algorithmic export controls, which seem to me to be like pretty difficult to do in general. You know, even if it's just companies developing them privately, but like nigh impossible if things are open source. Danny, do you have some takes on this sort of applying this sort of like control framework to software?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a balance in code, right? You have the open source model, which is designed for easy distribution, try to get the code into everyone's hands, allow every engineer to remix and rebuild. And that's created the foundation of the modern web, which is built on open systems, open protocols, open networks. Export controls, the DC mindset, is basically the polar opposite. It's the antipody. People want control. Only some people get the code, others do not. It's proprietary. It's dominated by a few players. And it's very antithetical to the ethos that most computer scientists have, because almost every computer scientist relies on open source code every single day to do their job. And so I think there's always been a fundamental tension between this kind of Silicon Valley open ethos versus this sort of export controls. Only some countries get the best code, others don't. Which in some fundamental way, or at least for a lot of Silicon Valley folks who I hang out with, no one understands how that even works. Because how do you kind of freely distribute to half the world but not the other half?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone's seen that comic of where like you have the giant stack of books that's all like software that reaches some product, and then there's like a Jenga block holding up the other side of it that's like some open source software maintained
Right.
by a guy in Montana, maintained by one person in Montana, where I think OpenAI ran into this issue. I think it was a Redis bug, if I remember correctly, where just GBT just fell apart because of a bug in open source, because like they just that's what everyone uses, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, going all the way back to Heartbleed, if you remember the bug from OpenSSL.
We're dating ourselves.
No. I know. It's my first time I learned about this, but it was like OpenSSL runs every single encrypted transaction on the web. Every e-commerce company relies on it. It's universal. And there was one guy, literally a guy, whose job it was to maintain this library. And when he didn't show up to work, so to speak, for free to help the web out, all e-commerce transactions kind of, slow to a crawl. And what ended up happening was Google kind of funded it, and a couple other companies kind of came together and was like, maybe we should have someone who runs this critical infrastructure doing this full time. And so, I think it's interesting because I see kind of like a hydra in DC. You have this kind of view that certain technology shouldn't be exported. But then at the same time, you have this encouragement around Open RAN in cell networks, where you're trying to open up and take the proprietary technologies out of certain networks. So I just don't know. I mean, that's always the question in DC, I feel like, is there's just multiple philosophies all conflicting and no one understands what's going on.
Yeah, although to be clear, one area of influence DC can have over that is exports for hardware, right? So then there's a very specific kind of hardware that enables all of these technologies in the first place, run by 1.5 companies in the US. And so that is a point that they can constrict if they really want to, in order to sort of like exert influence over the like global AI development universe.
Yeah. We've done a lot of shows about hardware export controls. Maybe we'll say that one for another time. Let's keep going down our our alphabet soup of AI players. Databricks and Snowflake. What do they do?
If you map out this, the 30-year plan, and it follows exactly the route that Snowflake and Databricks want, they are a layer that abstracts out all the complicated stuff that is required to manage data in the cloud, and the way that they became very popular was just because instead of having to dig deep into like how AWS works, which is really, really complicated, like as anyone who's ever looked at an AWS dashboard once has been terrified, I think, the first time they ever look at it, by kind of lifting that layer, like putting like a wrapper on top of it that's very easy to interface, that someone who's just an analyst who knows SQL really well, they don't need to understand the intricacies of pipelines and data management. They could just use something like a Snowflake to access it. Snowflake makes it really easy to just like put this wrapper on top of it, in the same way that you could say that a programming language like C++ is a wrapper for assembly, right? And Python is a wrapper for C++ in a lot of ways. And so these things are just kind of like, it puts a layer that makes things simple. And so Snowflake and Databricks, like they're good at different things. Like Snowflake is really good for analytics, which is basically how do I determine interesting information from the data that I have about my customers? Like, are they churning? Am I losing them? Why am I losing them? How am I acquiring? Databricks has very much been focused on data science. So it's like, how can I create a model that helps me predict whether or not this customer will go away? So you can sort of say like very data science focused, oriented on predicting the future, analytics oriented on driving insights from the past. They kind of do this thing where they go back and forth into each other's turf, where it's like, Snowflake will want to get into machine learning and then back off a little bit, and Databricks will want to get into analytics and then back off a little bit and then go back and forth. But now they've sort of taken these differing approaches, which are both, technically accurate interpretations of how machine learning will work, setting aside stuff like OpenAI and things like that. In that Databricks is, you come to Databricks and I say, I want to create a chatbot that helps me onboard a new employee, for example, or something like that. And I have a very specific way of doing it. Maybe I'm like a tightly regulated company and I can't just like pull a model off the shelf and make some tweaks to it or something like that. So I take all of the data that I have, apply the same techniques or capabilities that have gone into creating a ChatGPT or a Llama, and from there build a model from scratch that ends up powered by Databricks, where then I just send a Databricks link effectively to this new employee that's coming in, and they get access to a chatbot from the top to the bottom, right? So they have the data, they manage the construction of the model, they manage the deployment of the model, they manage how to train it, so on and so forth. Snowflake has all of your company data in the first place. And they've sort of taken this approach where they want to be the home for, you can pull a model in that's popular and make adjustments with it on your data, and then serve it through a tool that we have called Streamlit, or a variety of like other companies that we work with, powered on Snowflake. So you're still in your little pocket universe within our organization. So there are differing opinions on the way that these machine learning models are going to be inevitably deployed. They're both technically accurate. You could say that probably like Snowflake in the short term, that approach makes more sense, whereas Databricks' viewpoint may be a little bit more long term, I think, or like the time horizon for what it wants to accomplish might be a little bit longer term, in that, maybe they want to be a new interpretation of AWS or something like that. But the two companies are essentially shepherding how we're going to be deploying a lot of these open source or local hyper specialized models. Again, this is setting aside all the APIs and from OpenAI and Anthropic, Inflection and Cohere and the rest of these guys.
Let's talk about that, the sort of the comparison there, because multiple times in your newsletter you said, like, basically everyone I know who is using sort of this new generation of models in their work is either using GPT 3.5 or GPT-4. And I'm curious, like, do you have a take, Matt, on if we're looking at just one, like a world in which one model rules them all, or you're going to end up having to do these, like, there'll be like 50 things on the shelf and you'll have to like mix and match and what have you, like how, and maybe also like, how does the world look different for one versus the other?
Everyone has a different opinion about everything, and all of them are, 35% correct, I think, in some fashion or another. But the thing that, so these models have been around for a while, right? Or like language models have been around for a while. The thing, what OpenAI did, which was quite incredible, was the user experience they built around it. Because no one had ever seen something like ChatGPT. ChatGPT was technically possible in some ways, right? Maybe not at the level of sophistication of GPT 3.5, which is what powers ChatGPT. But no one had really kind of like brought it together and made it something that was that accessible. And the actual, using GPT in a tool, personally is just as easy. It's literally like a few lines of code. Like I literally did it for some text extraction 2 days ago. It took less than 10 minutes to put it all together. And so they've crafted a ridiculously good user experience. And there's obviously a lot of companies that are chasing that same approach. The flip side of that is you don't own anything. So if I, fine tune, using the term, like if I make adjustments to GPT-4 to specialize for my case, I don't necessarily like own that new model. I can't pull it down and say I want to save it on my server or something along those lines. Like OpenAI owns it. And when they make adjustments, even sometimes small adjustments, it can break things, which is true for any software, right? It's true for any software run by a company. Like small adjustments can just totally break deployments entirely. So relying on an API like OpenAI, or if Anthropic and the rest of them are successful, an API for a Claude is Anthropic's version, comes with the risks of any relying on any other software run by any company. Is they could just break it at any point, because I don't have and these models are in particular actually quite sensitive to changes. So you see a lot of chatbots, like I have a personal assistant, and OpenAI made an update and now she acts totally differently. The benefit with open source is you own the model, right? So you can make changes to it, and I get to save all my changes. I get to hold on to it. So if OpenAI updates something, it doesn't break it, because I'm the one that controls whether or not it gets updated and how it gets updated. Again, they're really differing interpretations of the way AI should be put as a product into use cases, consumer or enterprise. Both can be correct at the same time in really specific ways. So I think the framing is really challenging here, in that, is like, oh, does open source win or does closed source win? Well, like there are a lot of industries where there is a closed and open source version available. And what makes OpenAI really successful is how ridiculously easy it is to use, and the use cases for AI, we're still figuring it out. And like like we said earlier, or like I said earlier, it's often like the bored hobbyists that are going to figure out the crazy cool use cases for all this stuff. And they have access to open source, but they also have access to APIs, and so it's like, so we're still figuring out like what goes with what.
Sure. Danny, anything on that?
I think the key piece I would add is just it's evolving, right? So to follow up on the last comment here, about 6 months, AI has been around decades, right? It really comes out of the 60s. The latest generation really came out of the last 7 to 8 years with deep learning, and then transformers and a bunch of other technologies that have enabled this current generation of technologies. But the revolution is in progress, right? It's happening right now, and so not only do we not know the extent of the different products that are even possible yet, right? We're still inventing the intellectual technologies that are going to empower AI. It gets really hard when you try to translate that change that's happening in real time with, okay, well, exactly what companies are going to be structured, how are we going to have AI delivered to us, who's going to actually implement it. It's a complete open question. So for instance, let me give you a couple of different approaches. You could imagine a really compact model. We were talking about Llama earlier, that is installed by Apple on my iPhone, that processes all AI requests on device, which means that I have privacy, I have control, nothing's getting sent to another company. It fits the ethos of Apple. You can imagine a kind of monopolist, a search engine, let's say, who owns the model, has the biggest model in the world, no one else can compete with it. They don't release any of the details, everything's impossible to understand, but it works really, really well, and no one really cares, and we all use it, and it's free, and advertising somehow supports it. And then there's a bunch of enterprise use cases from, I want to make my HR software better. It has to follow certain laws around private information. And so maybe it's hosted on-prem, but it's going to be used as a service company. And so someone's going to implement that for me. That's very common. And I believe Databricks and Snowflake sort of fall into that category at times as well. You could also imagine, like, I'm a company that has no engineers whatsoever on staff. Like, please figure out everything for me and just deliver me a product that works. Think law firms processing legal data. They're not going to have a whole IT staff who have a bunch of PhDs with legal, natural language processing. And so they're going to need services that come to them and say, hey, do this. We're going to make sure your data is private and secure and following, bar standards. but we have no way of implementing it. So I think the range is going to be hugely diverse. It's underway. The revolution is happening. It's changing in real time. So there are no answers. No one has a good point. I'd end with a quote from Ben Evans, who had a great piece on this week. Ben Evans is a well-known tech analyst for the last 10 years, but he was exploring the subject, and his quote was that there's a huge difference between an amazing demo of a transformative technology and something that a big, complicated company holding other people's business can use.
Yeah, and I think like a lot of people say like, oh, iPhone moment, right? Which the analogy is pretty good. You know, when the iPhone came out, like what did we end up with killer use cases? Like Candy Crush, well, you probably could have predicted that games we probably could have predicted that games would be successful, but like, you know, broadcasting my badass Milfoy to the world, like could we have like figured like that was going to be a natural outcome of this? Like not necessarily, because the cameras on them sucked, and like we didn't have this idea of how network effects were going to work, and APIs were brand new at the time, you know, at the same time that the iPhone was coming out, so we didn't really understand the consequences, or like my phone is a key for everything, including my passwords. Not necessarily, right?
Apple Pay, when the iPhone was released, there was no App Store. It did three things. It made phone calls. You could do text messages. There was an iMessages. You could only text. And you could browse the web, and a pretty bad version of the web with the original Safari browser. And from that became Uber and Facebook and Instagram and Apple Pay and every financial product and mobile banking. And so, you know, again, we're just at the cusp. You know, iPhone was 07. The App Store, I believe, is 09. A lot of these apps come out in 2010 to 2012. So, you know, give it a couple of years and we're going to see just the huge vistas opening up before us.
So speaking of awesome demos, which aren't products yet, agents. Matt, what are those? And what's the I mean, who knows how it's going to play out, but what's the optimistic future of what
it's very different from the Langley version of agents.
Yeah, so the notion of an agent is you know, using things like a large language model to orchestrate something to act on my behalf to accomplish some arbitrary task. You know, that ranges from the Hustle GPT folks on Twitter being like, create a business for me, but selling t-shirts, and how I generated $15,000 in revenue in 2.5 seconds using Auto GPT, all the way to what are some discoveries I can make through the use of agents, like actual real scientific discoveries, by allowing it to iterate. You know, you can using agents, you can simulate two professors yelling at each other over a problem, right? If you really wanted to, and it's this way of simulating something to act on your behalf. You know, there is an open source, speaking of open source again, there is an open source tool out there called Auto GPT, which again is easy enough to use that someone as dumb as I am able to figure it out, right? And essentially says like, hey, like, can I, you know, execute this type of code to read this website to look whether or not a PlayStation 5 is available? Would have been great if we had this a year ago, right? But to just do these things on my behalf. And, you know, Auto GPT is you can sort of have it in check, or you can let it run autonomously, which I don't advise, obviously, because there's a lot of problems that not like arbitrary code execution. There's a lot of problems because it like runs into a lot of walls and tends to fall off the rails pretty fast. But the idea of agents is actually kind of a natural consequence of not necessarily just the limitations of GPT-4, but like this explosion of different highly specialized language models, where it's like, this model is actually good for this specific thing and this model is good for this specific thing. What if I could use them both, and how can I use them both? I construct this entity to basically say like, use this for that and use this one for that, and to accomplish this task, where the end result is an email to Danny Crichton reminding him that you know, we have a podcast coming up in a couple days or something along those lines, to just do this on my behalf. That's the extreme bull case, is like that you have something that you just press a button and it orchestrates all this stuff for you. There's a lot of complicated pieces there happening in between. The biggest one of which is that these models hallucinate, which is a terrible term. We need a new term for it, I think. But they'll sort of like arbitrarily grab incorrect information, which is a byproduct of the way this data is stored and managed. and the techniques used to sort of retrieve that data. And so like one error here can turn into 3 errors here, which is 5 errors here, which is what's the next one in the Fibonacci sequence? 9, right? Whatever, right? I got that one wrong right away, but they can kind of multiply down the line, and get worse and worse and worse. And so like agents, it's a very, very early concept, as maybe 2-3 months old ish, right? It's the fastest growing open source project of all time, as far as I understand. And the community is very lively in the discords. So that's another good example of like a very community driven product that's like created a lot of really interesting use cases. But there's a ton of other things happening. There's a startup called Generally Intelligent, I think is looking at using agents for research purposes and things like that. Actually, don't quote me on that, because like strike that. Because I'm not 100%, edit that out because I'm not 100% sure. But there is a lot of like interesting things happening behind the scenes.
Well, I think that the challenge is verification, right? You always have to go back to, you're talking about hallucinations, which I agree with you, the name should change. I think one of the biggest challenges though is when you are giving the keys to your kingdom to someone else, you have to trust that that agent is going to do what you hope it's going to do. And anyone who studied economics knows the agent principle problem, that you yourself are always going to have your best interests at heart, and AI is an agent, so it's not necessarily knowing exactly what your interests are. And so when we look at AutoGPT, for instance, like it generally works. It's amazing. Like you can actually ask it to do complicated tasks. Like a task might be go make me money. And people have shown that it will actually go out, learn how to make money by building online storefronts, start selling and drop shipping. I mean, it's incredible. People have actually made thousands of dollars with a single line of text into a agent bot. The problem is when it makes mistakes, and you don't know when it's going to make a mistake. You don't know where in the process it's going to happen, because very little in the AI world is actually verified or based on kind of fundamental facts. And so, similar to what we just talked about with enterprise, where it's one thing to show an amazing demo, but it's really the edge cases that drive whether it can be used in a production environment. I think the same thing is true for agents. You have a real challenge of, how good does it have to be to get to where it needs to go? And, we're seeing a ton of companies, I'm looking at the venture side, we've seen a ton of companies, say, in healthcare, right? There's a massive doctor shortage, there's a massive nursing shortage post-COVID, burnout is really high. Clearly, there's a need for a way for me to text my doctor and get an immediate response. They can't do that because they're in the operating room or an exam room. So an agent would be super helpful. But, if an AI is going to give the wrong answer 1 in 10,000 times or even 1 in 100,000 times, and you suddenly have deaths and people are taking the wrong drugs or the wrong dosages, is that good enough? And my view has actually been similar to autonomous vehicles, where there is a crossover point where humans also make mistakes, and we could probably calculate the difference and start to statistically say, like, look, if you ask a tired doctor at the end of their shift this question, or AI, at some point, the AI is probably more accurate, in the same way that a drunk driver is far more dangerous to California roads than Waymo today. Yeah. And so to me, that's the hard part for, I think, a lot of regulators is like, we've seen this with a lot of the AV controversies in the last, couple of years. It's really hard to kind of give up the keys and say, statistically, on average, the AI is safer. We just kind of like the idea that there's a human driver in there that we can imprison. You can't really imprison AI. There's no consequence if there's a mistake.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this comes back to like with AI specifically, there has to be a mental model shift in the way we interpret this as like a tool. So computer science classically, so there's this notion of stateful versus stateless in computer science, where stateful, you have like a concept of memory, like I can remember the last things that I've done, whereas a large language model is stateless in that it cannot remember the last things that it did because it's frozen in time. And a lot of people have talked about this as an issue and ways you get around it. You can get around it by basically like making sure that when you send it a prompt, it saves that information, loads it into the next prompt to basically say like, okay, like the last thing you said was X, so make sure you include that in your answer for the next one. And I'm sure you've noticed if you send a prompt off to GPT and send it a second time, you'll get 2 different responses, because it is statistics, right? It is like a kind of grabbing the nearest pieces of information and hoping it puts together something correct. And it's a hard mental model to shift to when we've spent 30, let's go back to IBM, 30 years, I guess.
IBM's been dead for decades. I don't know, Watson. Just say Watson. They love Watson.
Yeah, sure. Thinking about this way in like a classic comp sci approach, whereas this is like it's a harder paradigm to grasp with existing comp sci methodologies and ways of thinking about this stuff.
I think people will get there eventually. I don't know. It's like statistics. It's uncertainty. Like once people start. Anyways, we'll talk about that later. Let's close with some policy takes. I don't know, Matt. From your view, are there any legislative initiatives or investments that you'd be really excited to see, or pitfalls you'd advise folks in Washington to avoid as they think about their role in ushering along and stewarding this emerging industry?
Was it Senator Schumer that gave a presentation not too long ago? He had this quote, which is if we take the typical path, holding congressional hearings with open statements and each member asking questions 5 minutes at a time on different issues, we simply won't be able to come up with the right policies. By the time we act, AI will evolve into something new. So we saw this happen with Facebook and the hearings around social media and stuff like that, and at how it was kind of ridiculous to watch them. And imagine the challenges of something like that for a tool like Facebook, which is well established, and doing the same things with AI, which on a weekly basis changes.
Yeah,
literally weekly. There's some new piece of technology or new methodology or new area of interest that emerges that has exactly as much promise as the previous one. So, agents is a good example. That's a recent development, but like we're already moving on to like the next thing. Right. So like we're already exploring areas. There's one area that's interesting called chain of thought. There's another area that's interesting that I've heard about, which is called I'm calling prompt routing effectively. Right. But it's like by the time something is talked about in an environment like Congress, we've moved on to the next thing, and there's a lag. And so the whatever the classic approach that's being taken for Facebook or some of these other regulations is going to be really challenging because we are so early in this development cycle, and you look at the iPhone, right? Things were changing on a daily basis, and like they got a free pass to do whatever they wanted basically. So I think it's gonna have to require something a little bit more nimble. But at the same time, you see a lot of the people that are being called into these discussions are people like Sam Altman, who runs the probably most important AI company or most established AI company in the world right now, who has their own opinions. And it's how do you balance these opinions from people that are very smart and like built these companies and like know how these technologies work at a very intricate level, but have an agenda in some fashion or another, whether they realize it or not, right? There are incentives at play across the board. There are incentives in open source to keep it at open source development. There are incentives in closed source to ensure that there are ways to protect them from literally like a revenue perspective. There are incentives there are competing incentives for literally everything. And so it's probably like it's going to be probably one of the most challenging regulatory problems that we've faced in tech in a very long time. But there also has to be a extreme level of care taken because any regulation is going to be really complicated, and the US is like a very clear leader in AI development right now by orders of magnitude, right? You have Meta with Llama. Meta is an American company. You have OpenAI with GPT-4. OpenAI is an American company. And so there's going to be that is another competing interest at play here. to have to align. And so it's sort of like, how can we move quickly enough to keep up with all these developments, while also making sure that we like tread extraordinarily carefully to ensure that these things are developed in a responsible way and we're not falling behind in other ways.
I think, when you come to DC, everyone always thinks in terms of laws, in terms of rules, in terms of policymaking. It's a legal field, right? DC is the highest percentage of lawyers of any city in the country. But I think given the speed of what's going on in AI, none of these processes can keep up in time, right? Like AI is changing hour by hour, as Matthew knows, having to cover all of this and supervise in a way that I don't have to. Literally things are changing, multiple times per day. And so, to my mind, you need much more nimble approaches. One is focusing on just culture, and having a culture of self-regulation in the industry. So, unlike crypto, which was built around a culture of kind of rebelliousness to the state, trying to fight, supremacy of the U.S. dollar, AI is fundamentally a scientific academic discipline. Its fundamental core kernel, if you will, is a culture of do no harm, a culture of I don't want to see my tool be used for evil or for something terrible. I really just want to make something good that works well in the world. And so it's much more receptive to finding approaches to have high safety and trust. One of the interesting things is when you go to an AI conference, like it really is totally aligned between kind of DC and Silicon Valley. There's not a lot of folks who are trying to like blow up the system and fight all this. They don't want their systems to be used for discrimination. They don't want it to be used to, find new forms of biological and chemical warfare. Like no one's trying to do that. And so to my mind, public-private partnerships, finding industry consortia that helps us self-regulate, finding ways that are much more nimble that can adapt to how this industry changes quickly and evolves quickly over the next weeks, months, years, is far better than trying to come up with some sort of regulatory framework or an agency that comes up with a 90-day window because, fundamentally the policymaking and rulemaking processes of DC, like the actual times you have to give for comments, as an example, are actually too long. Like it just doesn't work. It's sort of like, can you imagine if what you would actually need is like, okay, here's a rule in the morning. We need comments by 5 because we need this rule out by tomorrow because this new technology just came out and has implications. Like it just doesn't work at speed. And so I think much more nimble approaches work because the culture is amenable to it in a way that I think some other industries, which are more disruptive and corrosive, were not.
Yeah, and I mean, I think especially within that culture too, there are a lot of unsolved problems that everyone agrees need to be solved, and like by solving them, we actually further this notion of safe AI. Like the black box of like how this data is encoded and embedded within these models for when it's pulled out, and like why do these models hallucinate? Like these are currently unsolved or semi-solved problems that, in solving them or understanding them better makes things easier from a regulatory perspective. And so, they're like, how can we like supercharge that? Like, how can we put as many resources behind solving these in the first place? Because everyone agrees they should be solved. They're like, and so I think it's sort of like, what can policymakers and what can the government do to like get this going faster? Because that's one way of doing that.
I mean, it's interesting because Matt, I almost feel like there are two buckets of AI sort of like regulatory issues. There are ones where like the solution means more money for everyone, and then there are others where the solution means more money for some people and less money for other people. Making like the AI outputs more legible, or like having like a new data framework that like will open up more industries to like be comfortable with this. Like that is a like positive sum thing for basically everyone in the industry. Now if you want to start on the other side, if you want to start talking about the regulatory barriers that a lot of industries are going to try to put up to not have to change the way they do business, or sort of anti-competition issues where maybe folks are I'm sure pretty soon we're going to start to have and Senator Schumer raised this himself of like just how consolidated are we going to want this to be, and the U.S. government could put a real thumb on the scale when it comes to open source versus closed source on what they're going to buy from at a simplest level what sort of stuff they're going to start implementing in their own systems, and more broadly what they're going to allow to to go out in the marketplace. And Danny, no offense, but like the public-private model of like light touch, like let's let industry figure it out, will probably play out pretty well for Lux Capital. So it's going to be really tricky. But I do think coming back to the speech, this idea of him framing of the senator framing it as innovation as the North Star, and like at the end of the day there are going to be a lot of complicated things, and we're not really sure what's going to happen. Agents one day, chain of thought the next. But I think starting from the perspective of we cannot be sure what is going to happen, but you don't want to kill the golden goose, and you don't want to sort of create a sort of regulatory framework, which, because you're sort of scared of some downsides, which all technological change brings, you don't necessarily want to sort of close ourselves off to futures where this technology can be like really impactful and improve people's lives in a really radically amazing set of ways.
Yeah, well, I mean, like if you look at, if you remember some of these Facebook hearings, like Mark Zuckerberg is the first person that'll be like, we should be regulated. Like, yes, of course you would say that because it's good for you. You're already like established. You're already entrenched here. And so like if you get to, like you said, if you get to help write or guide the rules here, like you get a lot of power there. But one thing I'll sort of leave with this is Danny, you mentioned this thing about academics, right? And how a lot of the people in this industry are coming out of academia. You see PhDs in physics, PhDs in neuroscience, PhDs in comp sci. It's like there was a joke I heard one time that was like, no, like I love PhDs in physics. They make great data scientists. But the academic world where most, if not all, these projects came into existence, I think Spark is an example, right, if I'm remembering correctly, and like a lot of these other open source projects that came into existence, they were born out of academia, and academia has been very like maligned as like the place to do cutting edge work. And Google and Meta and the rest of these guys position themselves, it's like, well, if you want to have real impact, like come work for us. So what is there that can be done to facilitate a lot of this work that's happening in academia that where a lot of these projects clearly came out of, right? A lot of these very powerful technologies were born in these environments, right? And so what can be done there to better facilitate that instead of just focusing on corporate stuff?
So there's a really great PhD thesis by Jade Lung, which she published in 2019, and it sort of like traces the arc of really important dual use technologies over the 20th century, and she focuses on sort of communications as well as satellite stuff. And this pattern of sort of researchers, obviously the researchers are going to be creating the new technologies, but she writes that, ultimately the researchers fade into the backdrop, constrained by their dependence on R&D funding and by the legislative environment. Their influence as actors waned, and you very quickly start to see corporations as well as governments be the ones that are driving the rules of the road and sort of setting the norms and whatnot. So, we're still at this very early stages. We talked about we're 6 months in, and at this moment, you still have like the good vibes of academia, and you still have, idealists who are founders who are trying to shape the ways and to shape the development of this trajectory in the ways that it might, in sort of in accordance with their beliefs. But governments are more powerful than researchers, and if AI really hits in the way that some people think it will, these decisions ultimately are going to be out of the hands of the original inventors, which is, obviously Robert Oppenheimer is the sort of classic example of someone who creates something only for it to sort of spin far out beyond what he envisioned. So savor this moment when we still have the AI researchers being the ones who are sort of driving and shaping the discussion, because the window may not be open for much longer.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jonathan Frankel, who's one of the chief scientists at Mosaic ML, which just got bought by Databricks for $1.3 billion. at an event I was watching last night, and first thing he said was like, "Guys, get your NeurIPS papers in. Like they're due in 7 hours." For NeurIPS is like this big, conference where a bunch of academics meet and discuss some like emerging techniques and technologies and some of the cooler cutting edge science. So it's just like this is one of the people that's like working on a technology that just got bought for 1.3 billion, right? So that's where we are right now, and like you said, we'll see where it goes.
Danny, closing thoughts?
None here. There's just so much more to talk about. I mean, you could have an entire podcast just devoted to AI politics going on today.
You
could.
We got to launch AI Talk. It doesn't exist yet, but there wasn't a ton of China in here. Anyways, you know what? If you want to be the founding sponsor of AI Talk, which covers AI from a national security and politics more broadly perspective, brought to you by Jordan Schneider, reach out. I'm at jordan@chinatalk.media.
A song.
Yeah.
Oh man, I just listen to like lo-fi beats to relax/study to all day these days. So,
all right, we can work with that. Thanks so much for being a part of China Talk, you two.
Jordan, thank you so much.